historically, catastrophically, almost impossibly unpopular. For context, when Rahm Emanuel decided to step away from Chicago politics, his approval was hovering in the low 40s. That's nearly 7 times higher than Johnson's current standing. Think about what it takes to get to 6%. That means almost no one, not your political allies, not the community leaders who championed you, not even the staffers who work for you believes you're doing a good job anymore. That's not a political problem, that's an existential crisis. So, what went wrong? Well, it started with decisions that looked good on paper, but collapsed under the weight of reality. Johnson championed what he called sanctuary city policies, essentially, making Chicago a safe haven for people who entered the country illegally. Now, immigration is a complicated topic, and reasonable people disagree about the best approach. But here's where theory met reality in the worst possible way. The city started spending massive amounts of taxpayer money. We're talking well into the hundreds of millions of dollars on services for people who weren't legal residents. Meanwhile, neighborhoods that had been struggling for decades, mostly Black and Hispanic communities that voted for Johnson, saw those resources flowing away from them. Housing that could have gone to local families went to new arrivals. Schools that needed support got stretched even thinner. And the people who had been waiting for help, they got frustration. Imagine you've lived in a neighborhood your whole life. You've paid taxes, you followed the rules, you've waited patiently for your city to invest in your schools, your streets, your safety, and then suddenly you watch your mayor pour resources into people who just arrived while you're still waiting for the basics. How would that feel? That's not a theoretical question. That's what happened. And the backlash wasn't from some fringe group. It came from the very communities Johnson claimed to represent. Town halls turned heated. Protests erupted. People who had voted for him started wearing anybody but Brandon t-shirts. This wasn't a right-wing conspiracy. This was betrayal felt by everyday people who thought they'd elected someone who would fight for them. But political discontent, as painful as it is, usually stays in the realm of elections and public opinion. What happened next pushed this situation into entirely new territory. Chicago has always been a tough city. It's got a reputation for crime, yes, but also for resilience, for strong communities, for people who look out for each other. But over the past couple of years, something changed. Violent crime, particularly tied to organized gangs from outside the country, started to escalate in ways that shocked even longtime residents. You've probably heard of MS-13, the gang that terrorized parts of the East Coast and Southwest. Well, there's a newer player that's just as dangerous, Trenda Aragua. It's a Venezuelan gang that's been spreading across the United States as migration from South America increased, and they're not subtle. We're talking about gang members who take over entire apartment buildings, intimidate residents, extort money, and turn neighborhoods into war zones. This wasn't some abstract threat. This was happening in real time in Chicago's South Side in predominantly Black neighborhoods, where families were literally afraid to leave their homes. Residents called the police. They called the mayor's office. They posted videos online showing gang members openly loitering outside their buildings, harassing anyone who walked by. And what did Mayor Johnson do? He downplayed it. He said the reports were exaggerated. He accused people of racism for even suggesting that newly arrived migrants could be involved in crime. In other words, he chose ideology over reality. He chose protecting his political image over protecting the people who needed his help. That's when the federal government got involved. Now here's where things get really interesting, because what happened next wasn't just a local story anymore. It became a national flashpoint about the very nature of law and order in America. Federal Immigration Enforcement, known as ICE, started conducting operations in Chicago. Their job is to enforce federal immigration law, which means finding and deporting people who are in the country illegally, especially those who've committed crimes. On one particular night, ICE agents were conducting a raid in an area known to be controlled by gang members. And as they were working, something unprecedented happened. Protesters surrounded them. Not just a few people. We're talking about crowds who physically blocked their vehicles, shouted threats, and tried to prevent them from doing their job. Now, in any normal situation, local police would step in, First responders help first responders, right? That's the code. If a firefighter calls for backup, you send backup. If a paramedic is in danger, you protect them. If federal agents are surrounded by a hostile crowd, local police show up to keep the peace. But that's not what happened. Chicago's chief of patrol, one of the highest-ranking officers in the police department, issued what's called a stand-down order. Essentially, he told Chicago police officers not to respond when ICE called for help. Can you imagine that? Federal officers surrounded, potentially in danger, and the local police department says, not our problem. The National Fraternal Order of Police, which represents officers across the country, called this one of the most shocking and disgusting acts they'd ever witnessed. And they weren't exaggerating. The entire foundation of law enforcement is mutual support. You might disagree with a policy, you might not like a particular agency, but when officers are in danger, you respond. Always. Except this time, politics overrode duty. Mayor Johnson had made it clear he didn't want Chicago police cooperating with federal immigration enforcement. He'd signed an executive order creating what he called ICE-free zones, areas of the city where federal agents supposedly couldn't operate without local permission. Of course, that's not how federal law works. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution makes federal law superior to state and local law. A mayor can't just declare parts of his city off-limits to federal authorities any more than he can declare them exempt from paying federal taxes. But Johnson tried anyway, and his police chief, whether out of loyalty or political pressure, went along with it. That decision changed everything. When word got out that Chicago police had refused to help federal agents, the reaction was swift and severe. Police unions across the country condemned it. Legal experts called it unconstitutional. And, perhaps most importantly, President Trump saw it as an act of open defiance that couldn't be tolerated. Now, love him or hate him, Trump is not someone who backs down when challenged. And what happened next was his version of drawing a line in the sand, not just for Chicago, but for every sanctuary city in America. In a public statement that caught even his own advisors off guard, Trump called for Mayor Johnson and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker to be arrested. Not fined, not reprimanded, arrested. The charge? Willfully failing to protect federal agents in the line of duty. Now, whether that's legally viable is a question for courts to sort out. But the political message was crystal clear. If you're a local official who thinks you can obstruct federal law enforcement, you're not just going to face criticism. You're going to face consequences. And Trump didn't stop with words. Within hours, he authorized federal raids across Chicago on a scale the city hadn't seen in decades. He deployed units of the Texas National Guard, yes, from another state, to assist ICE operations. He sent Black Hawk helicopters to support tactical teams. And he made it clear that Chicago's permission was neither requested nor required. Over the next 2 days, federal agents arrested more than 1,000 people. Among them were dozens of members of Tren de Aragua, including key leaders who'd been operating openly in neighborhoods for months. Entire apartment complexes that had been effectively controlled by gang members were cleared out. Residents who'd been living in fear watched as the people who'd been terrorizing them were led away in handcuffs. And you know what happened? Many of those residents applauded, they cheered, they posted videos online thanking the federal agents, because despite all the political rhetoric about authoritarianism and overreach, what they saw was simple. For the first time in a long time, someone was actually doing something to make their neighborhood safer. This is where it gets really uncomfortable for Mayor Johnson, because while the people he claimed to represent were celebrating, he went on television and called the whole operation racist. He appeared on MSNBC, a network that's usually friendly to Democratic mayors, and proceeded to have what can only be described as a meltdown. He was emotional, defensive, and at times incoherent. He accused Trump of declaring war on poor people. He said the raids were targeting black neighborhoods to intimidate minority communities. He claimed the whole thing was unconstitutional and demanded that it stop immediately. But here's the problem with his argument. The facts didn't support it. The neighborhoods that were raided were indeed predominantly black and Hispanic, but they weren't targeted because of their demographics. They were targeted because that's where the gang activity was concentrated. Federal agents didn't randomly pick addresses out of a hat. They had intelligence, they had complaints from residents, and they had evidence of criminal activity. When the superintendent of Chicago's own police department was asked about this, he had to publicly correct his boss on live television. He explained as politely as he could that federal agents have their own legal authority, that local police can't arrest them, and that the operations were based on legitimate law enforcement priorities. It was an extraordinary moment, the kind of thing that almost never happens in politics. Your own police chief essentially saying, "With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, you're wrong." And that's when it became clear just how isolated Johnson had become. Think about leadership for a moment. Real leadership, not the performance of it. A real leader adapts when the evidence changes. A real leader listens when their own people say there's a problem. A real leader prioritizes outcomes over optics. Mayor Johnson did none of those things. Instead, he doubled down. He kept insisting that the real problem wasn't gang violence or his policy failures. It was Trump. It was racism. It was anything except the decisions he'd made. This is what happens when someone confuses virtue signaling with governance. It's easy to make grand pronouncements about compassion and justice. It's much harder to make sure the streetlights work, the garbage gets picked up, and people feel safe walking to the store. Those unglamorous tasks, that's what governance actually is. And when you neglect them in favor of political theater, the system breaks down. I've seen this pattern in business too. A CEO who focuses more on press releases than product quality, a manager who cares more about being liked than being effective, it never ends well. Because reality eventually always reasserts itself. You can ignore it for a while, you can spin narratives, you can blame external forces, but at some point, the feedback loop catches up with you. In Chicago, that moment arrived when Johnson's approval collapsed to historic lows, when his own police force started ignoring his orders, when the communities he claimed to champion started protesting against him, when even friendly media outlets started asking uncomfortable questions. And here's the deepest irony. Johnson kept invoking the language of justice and accountability. He said law enforcement needed to be held accountable. He said systems needed to be reformed. He said leaders needed to answer to the people. But when it came time for him to be held accountable, he deflected. He made excuses. He blamed everyone except himself. There's a concept in engineering and systems thinking called a feedback loop. It's simple. Outputs become inputs. The results of your actions feed back into your decision-making, allowing you to adjust and improve. Healthy systems have strong feedback loops. They self-correct. But what happens when you disable the feedback loop? What happens when you ignore the signals telling you something's wrong? The system fails. Catastrophically. That's what we're watching in Chicago. A mayor who's cut himself off from feedback from his police, from his constituents, from reality itself. And the result is a city in crisis, a leader in meltdown, and a federal government stepping in to do what local leadership wouldn't. Now, you might be wondering, how did someone get elected mayor of a major American city without understanding these basic principles? How does someone rise to that level of leadership while being so fundamentally unprepared for the job? The answer tells us something important about the difference between the public sector and the private sector, and why that difference matters more than ever. In the business world, performance is measured constantly. Sales numbers, profit margins, customer satisfaction scores, they're all right there, visible to everyone. If you're running a company and your performance drops, you don't get to explain it away with good intentions. Your board asks hard questions. Your investors demand change. And if you can't deliver results, you're out. But in government, the rules are completely different. Politicians can fail upward in ways that would be impossible anywhere else. You can oversee declining schools, rising crime, crumbling infrastructure, and fiscal disaster, and as long as you say the right things, you can keep your job for years. Brandon Johnson is a perfect example of this. Before becoming mayor, he was a county commissioner and a teachers' union organizer, perfectly respectable positions. But here's the thing. Those roles never required him to manage anything at scale. He never had to run a large organization. He never had to make payroll for thousands of employees. He never had to balance a multi-billion-dollar budget. He never had to make the kind of tough calls where someone's always going to be unhappy. What he did have was the ability to make speeches, to talk about values, to position himself as the candidate of change. And in a political environment where those skills matter more than management experience, that was enough. But once he got into office, that inexperience showed immediately. And nowhere was it more obvious than in how he responded to criticism. During one press conference, Johnson tried to defend his record by pointing to crime statistics. He said that murders were down by something like 30 to 35% compared to the previous year. He presented this as a major achievement, something Chicagoans should be celebrating. Now, let's think about that for a second. Imagine you hire a security company to protect your neighborhood, and at the end of the year, they come to you and say, "Great news! Only 600 or 700 people were killed this year instead of 900. We should be celebrating." Would you celebrate? Would you think that company had done a good job? Of course not. You'd say, wait a minute. Hundreds of people still died. Families were still destroyed. Communities are still traumatized. The fact that it's less than last year doesn't mean the problem is solved. But that's the mindset of someone who's never had to meet real performance standards. In the private sector, if you're in cybersecurity and breaches drop by 35%, you're not getting a bonus, you're getting fired. The standard is protecting people, not just failing slightly less than you did last year. This is what happens when you spend your entire career in environments where there's no real accountability, where budgets come from, taxpayers, whether you perform well or not, where your job security depends more on political connections than on results. You start to believe that mediocrity is excellence, that marginal improvement deserves applause, that good intentions matter more than outcomes. And the people who suffer, they're not politicians or bureaucrats. They're the everyday residents who just want to live their lives safely, who want their kids to get a decent education, who want their tax dollars used wisely. In Chicago, those people, especially in the Black and Hispanic neighborhoods that had been Johnson's strongest supporters, started speaking out. There were community meetings that turned into shouting matches. Parents demanding to know why their schools were being asked to absorb hundreds of new students with no additional resources. Business owners asking why their neighborhoods were being used as dumping grounds for city problems. Longtime residents wondering why people who'd just arrived were getting services that they'd been waiting years to receive. One particularly painful moment came when a group of residents from the South Side held a protest outside City Hall. These weren't political activists or opposition party members. These were working families, many of them elderly, many of them lifelong Democrats, who felt completely abandoned by their own mayor. One woman, I remember watching this video, spoke directly to the camera. She said something like, "We voted for him because he promised to help us. But all he's done is fill our neighborhood with people who don't follow the rules, who take over our buildings, who make us afraid in our own homes. And when we complain, he calls us racist. We're not racist. We're just tired of being forgotten." That's heartbreaking. And it's devastating for Johnson politically, because it exposes the fundamental lie at the center of his whole approach, that opposing his immigration policies means opposing compassion, that wanting safe neighborhoods means lacking empathy, that demanding accountability equals bigotry. The people in those neighborhoods saw through that immediately. They understood that real compassion means taking care of everyone in your community, not just the people who fit your political narrative. Real justice means enforcing rules fairly, not exempting some groups because it's politically convenient. Real leadership means listening to your constituents even when they're telling you things you don't want to hear. Johnson failed every one of those tests. And then came the raid that exposed just how deep the problem had become. Federal agents had been gathering intelligence for months on a particular apartment complex on Chicago's South Side. Residents had filed dozens of complaints. There were reports of intimidation, extortion, drug dealing, weapons possession. Multiple people had called both local police and federal tip lines, saying they were afraid to leave their apartments because gang members controlled the building. So federal authorities planned a coordinated operation. This wasn't some hasty decision made in anger. This was months of preparation, involving multiple agencies, ICE, FBI, ATF, Border Patrol, all working together with legal authorization from federal judges. When the operation went down, it looked like something out of a military operation, because in a sense that's what it was. Hundreds of agents moved in simultaneously. Black Hawk helicopters provided aerial support, tactical teams secured the perimeter, and they went floor by floor through the building, identifying everyone inside and checking their legal status. The media coverage was immediate and intense. You saw footage of agents in tactical gear, helicopters overhead, armored vehicles on the street. And the initial narrative from some outlets was about federal overreach, about militarization, about heavy-handed tactics. But then something interesting happened. Reporters started talking to the residents, and those residents told a very different story. They said gang members had been controlling the building for months. They said people were afraid to go to the laundry room or check their mail because they might be confronted. They said children couldn't play outside. They said elderly residents had stopped leaving their apartments entirely. And when federal agents cleared out those gang members, when they arrested several dozen people who had no legal right to be in the country and were actively terrorizing others, those residents didn't condemn it. They thanked them. Some of them cried with relief. One elderly man, speaking to a local news crew, said something I'll never forget. He said, "I don't care who does it, city, state, federal, National Guard, I just want my home back. I just want to feel safe again." That's what this whole situation boils down to. Not politics, not ideology, just basic human dignity and security. But Mayor Johnson couldn't see it that way, or wouldn't, because admitting that federal intervention was necessary would mean admitting that his own policies had failed. It would mean acknowledging that his sanctuary city approach had created exactly the kind of environment where violent gangs could thrive. It would mean accepting responsibility. So instead, he did what politicians often do when confronted with uncomfortable truths. He changed the subject. He claimed the raids were racially motivated. He said Trump was targeting black neighborhoods to send a message. He implied that wanting to remove violent criminals from apartment buildings was somehow an attack on communities of color. This is a tactic we've seen deployed repeatedly in recent years, the weaponization of language around race and justice to deflect from actual problems. It goes like this. If you can frame any criticism or enforcement action as racist, you don't have to address the substance of the issue. You just attack the messenger. But here's the problem with that strategy. Eventually, people catch on, especially when they're the ones living with the consequences. The residents of that South Side apartment complex weren't asking, why are federal agents here? They were asking, why did it take so long? Where was our mayor? Where were our local police? Those are the questions Johnson couldn't answer, because answering them honestly would require admitting that he'd prioritized ideology over their safety, political positioning over their well-being, his own image over their daily reality. Meanwhile, President Trump wasn't backing down. In fact, he was expanding his focus. In a major policy announcement, Trump declared that his administration would treat Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. He said that groups coordinating attacks on federal facilities and officers would face federal prosecution. And he made it clear that this wasn't just about street-level protesters. They were going after organizers, funders, and enablers. Now, whether you agree with that approach or not, it represents a significant shift in how the federal government thinks about civil unrest and political violence. For years, local authorities in places like Portland, Seattle, and Chicago had essentially allowed groups to operate with impunity. Property damage, assaults on officers, intimidation of businesses, all of it was downplayed as mostly peaceful protest, even when the evidence showed otherwise. Trump's position was simple. Violence is violence, regardless of the political motivation. And if local governments won't maintain order, the federal government will. Intelligence reports had documented attacks on ICE facilities in several cities. In some cases, protesters had attempted to set fires, block entrances, or physically assault agents. There were published guides circulating online showing the layouts of federal buildings, photos of individual agents with their names and badge numbers, and calls for direct action. This wasn't theoretical. This was organized, targeted activity designed to intimidate federal law enforcement and obstruct legal operations. The Trump administration's response was to treat this as a national security issue rather than a local law enforcement matter. They started investigating funding sources, communications networks, and organizational structures. The message was clear. If you're going to operate like an insurgent group, you'll be treated like one. Whether that's the right approach is something reasonable people can debate. But what's not debatable is that something had shifted. The era of local governments simply refusing to enforce laws they disagreed with was coming to an end. Federal authority was being reasserted, and Chicago had become the test case. Think about what this city represents in the American imagination. It's Carl Sandburg's City of Big Shoulders, the industrial powerhouse of the Midwest. It's the birthplace of modern architecture, of the blues, of political machines, and powerful unions. It's a city of neighborhoods, of immigrants who built new lives, of resilience in the face of hard times. But it's also become a symbol of something else, the failure of progressive governance to deliver on its promises. Chicago has been controlled by Democratic mayors for generations. It's implemented virtually every policy that progressive activists advocate for. And yet it struggles with some of the worst violence, failing schools, and fiscal problems in the nation. That's not a political attack, that's just observable reality. And it raises an important question. If these policies haven't worked here, after decades of implementation, why would we expect them to work anywhere else? Mayor Johnson's collapse isn't just a personal failure. It's a test case for a whole approach to governance, one that prioritizes symbolic gestures over practical results, one that values ideological purity over problem solving, one that treats government as a platform for activism rather than a service provider for citizens. And the verdict from Chicago's residents is in. It doesn't work. What's happening now represents a fundamental reset. Federal law is being enforced whether local officials like it or not. Sanctuary city policies are being challenged in court. And, most importantly, residents are demanding that their leaders prioritize their safety and well-being over political posturing. This is what accountability looks like when it finally arrives. It's messy. It's confrontational. It's uncomfortable for everyone involved. But it's necessary. Because here's what I've learned from building companies and solving hard problems. Systems only improve when there's honest feedback. When you can't acknowledge problems, you can't fix them. When you punish truth-telling and reward spin, you create an environment where failure becomes inevitable. Chicago is learning that lesson the hard way, and hopefully other cities are paying attention. The question now is, what comes next? For Mayor Johnson, the outlook is bleak. With approval ratings in the single digits, with his own police force in open rebellion, with federal operations proceeding despite his objections, he's become politically irrelevant. He still has years left in his term, but he's governing in name only. The real decisions about Chicago's future are being made around him, not by him. For Chicago itself, there's opportunity in this crisis. Sometimes things have to break before they can be rebuilt properly. The city has a chance now to rethink its approach, to prioritize what actually works over what sounds good, to demand better from its leaders. And for America, Chicago is a preview of battles that are going to play out in cities across the country. The clash between local resistance and federal authority, the tension between ideological commitments and practical governance, the question of whether results matter more than rhetoric. These aren't easy questions. There are legitimate debates about federalism, about immigration policy, about how much enforcement is too much and how little is too little. Reasonable people will disagree. But here's what shouldn't be controversial. Leaders should be accountable to the people they serve. Policies should be judged by their outcomes, not their intentions. And everyone, regardless of their legal status or political affiliation, deserves to live safely, with dignity, in communities that function. Those are basic standards, and Mayor Johnson failed to meet them. The era of consequence-free failure in politics is ending. Not because Trump is uniquely powerful, or because federal authority is unlimited, but because citizens are demanding it. They're tired of excuses. They're tired of blame shifting. They're tired of leaders who talk endlessly about justice but can't keep their streets safe. So here's what this really means for all of us. Leadership matters. Not the performance of leadership, not the language of leadership, but actual leadership, the kind that makes hard decisions, that adapts to reality, that takes responsibility when things go wrong. Systems need feedback. Whether it's a city, a business, or a family, you have to be able to see problems clearly and respond to them honestly. When you filter everything through ideology or ego, you lose that ability. And results are what count. Not speeches, not promises, not good intentions. Actual, measurable, lived improvements in people's daily lives. Brandon Johnson forgot all of that. Or maybe he never understood it in the first place. Either way, his failure is now a warning to every other leader who might be tempted down the same path. At the end of the day, this isn't about one mayor or one city. It's about the future of American leadership. It's about whether results still matter more than words. It's about whether accountability is real or just something we talk about. If you believe that accountability should matter, that order should come before politics, that citizens deserve leaders who solve problems rather than create them, then stay engaged. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Trump's crackdown is the wake-up call America needed?